The question of whether terminally ill people should have the right to end their lives has been long discussed and debated. Well, this week, a new law was proposed. MPs have been left more divided than ever after some intense opposition to the bill. So is the assisted dying bill doomed, or is it likely to become law? And would it even work? Well, I'm Charlene White, and this is What You Need to Know. Hello and welcome to today's episode of What You Need to Know. I'm joined by our UK editor, Paul Brand. Now, this bill has been a long time coming, so what's involved?
So the last time MPs voted on this was actually almost a decade ago in 2015, so it's the first time it's come back to the Commons. There have been similar bills in the Lords, and what we got this week was the real detail of the bill, which MPs have been keen to see. It's officially called the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill. Emphasis on the terminally ill because the bill would only apply to people with less than 6 months to live with a terminal diagnosis. And that's important for lots of reasons because there are concerns about who exactly might be drawn into the bill. It applies in England and Wales. People who want to have an assisted death would have to prove that they had mental competence. That's quite a difficult one. But essentially, they'd have to make 2 declarations saying that they wanted an assisted death. And then they'd need to be assessed by 2 independent doctors to make sure they weren't being coerced. And finally, it would then go to a High Court judge to make the final decision. The person who's designed it, the MP, Kim Leadbeater, says that makes it the most stringent bill anywhere in the world. I think it probably does, actually, having studied this around the world. And she's also included in there a specific new legal offence of coercing someone into an assisted death, again, to try and cover off this sense that maybe vulnerable people would be drawn into the bill against their true wishes.
Now, she's put in all of these extra laws, potentially, to stop somebody being coerced in order to try and get this passed through. So how confident is she that it will get passed through?
I think if you'd asked her a few weeks ago, she would have said fairly confident. There was this huge momentum behind the bill. We interviewed Keir Starmer in March of this year when he was having a telephone call with Dame Esther Ranson, who's been campaigning on this, the broadcaster, of course, who wants the option of an assisted death for herself. And he told us at the time that he supported her calls. He thought it was absolutely right that Parliament should vote on this. He personally is in favour of assisted dying, or at least has been in the past. He said more recently that he needs to study the details of this bill. But there was this huge momentum behind that, which is partly why Kim Leadbeater brought the bill, because she thought it's got a good chance of getting through. There's a point to actually doing this. And then in more recent weeks, we've seen really big interventions from some key players, particularly the Health Secretary and also the Justice Secretary. And given that this is a matter largely about health and about the law, those 2 Secretaries of State are particularly relevant here. And I think Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary especially, has really made several interventions now that have made some MPs think twice. So he's said, in particular, that he has concerns about palliative care, the quality of palliative care, whether assisted dying would detract from a focus on palliative care and improving that. And he's also got concerns about vulnerable people and how they, again, might be pressured or feel themselves that they have to volunteer for assisted dying to maybe alleviate the stress for their family.
Now, one thing he's also said is that a change in the law could be costly to the NHS. How costly are we looking at?
Nobody really knows what the exact figures are. And this is where we get into some quite brutal language around death. So please, I hope nobody's offended in the way that we're talking about this, because, of course, there's lots of sensitivities around this and people will be feeling this very personally if they're listening to the podcast and they know somebody who's dying at the moment. But essentially, on the one hand, you can argue that assisted dying would be costly because you'd have to implement it somehow, somewhere. So in some countries, that's done in private clinics where you do have to pay out of your own money. In other countries, it's sort of integrated into their health system. So the NHS here, for example, or the hospice care system. So it's possible that it could cost public money in that way. If we're saying that we would make this a publicly available service that was free at the point of use, then of course that has implications for the NHS. On the flip side, it could be argued that if you are assisting people to die, then they won't be living for as long in palliative care. They perhaps won't be accessing NHS services for as long. Now, again, that is sensitive and that is controversial. And actually, that's an argument some use against assisted dying because they say maybe there might be pressure to save costs and say to somebody, actually, we don't think you're going to survive, so why don't you take an assisted death now rather than living through another few weeks of pain and costing the NHS X amount? So it's difficult, essentially, is the argument, to know exactly what the cost would be at this point. But that's what Wes Streeting has said he wants to investigate.
Now, you've spoken to Nathaniel. He's 38 and he did actually campaign on behalf of Wes Streeting at the last election. But he disagrees with Wes Streeting's stance on this. Why?
So this is an interesting dynamic because Nathaniel Dye was essentially the poster boy for the Labour campaign during the election when it came to the NHS. So Nathaniel I've met him, he's 38, he's a really, really lovely guy and absolutely determined that he's going to live out his life to the max. But he has terminal cancer and it started about 2 years ago. He was given a terminal diagnosis, and he believes that if he had been given that diagnosis sooner, he may not have ended up in a state where his prognosis is that his cancer is terminal. So during the election campaign, he did volunteer for the Labour Party to say, look, we need to improve the NHS, I waited too long. More recently, though, he's become a campaigner on assisted dying, and so he is now actually out of step with Wes Streeting, who he stood alongside in the past and campaigned alongside. The two are still friends, and they don't want, as most MPs don't want this to be a kind of antagonistic debate, a nasty debate. But nevertheless, he disagrees with Wes, and I think he's quite disappointed in some ways that Wes Streeting has taken this stance.
There are those, though, that perhaps don't feel that this bill actually goes far enough, though.
Yeah, because it doesn't apply to people with disabilities and it doesn't apply to people with mental health illnesses as well. There are countries around the world that have included people with certain mental disorders who can apply for an assisted death. I don't think that's really something that people here are particularly calling for, but certainly people with long-term chronic conditions that aren't necessarily deemed terminal. So MS, for example, isn't technically a terminal condition, even though people can live with it for a long time and can deteriorate over time and eventually sort of die with it and the effects of it. It's not classed as terminal, so they wouldn't be able to apply for an assisted death. And people in that situation who I've spoken to say they find that quite terrifying, that they may end up in a state that they're not happy with. They're not enjoying their life anymore, but they wouldn't be given this option. And in other countries, they would be. Okay.
Well, when is this debate coming to an end, and when is there likely to be a vote?
So the debate and the vote is on the 29th of November. That's called the second reading of the bill. So it's kind of the first vote that we'll get on the bill. And then after that, it goes into a long stage of parliamentary scrutiny if it survives that stage. And then there'll be a final vote on it later down the line. What's interesting is, as we were talking about right at the start of the podcast, originally we thought this would kind of fly through that second reading. I think it's a lot more finely cut now. And the advice to ministers at the start was don't discuss this publicly. It's a free vote. So in other words, MPs can vote however they want. They're not told how to vote. And ministers were told, don't get involved. It's supposed to be a free vote. We shouldn't be putting pressure on anyone. And now actually there's quite a lot of acrimony, I think, within government, because there have been ministers like Wes Streeting and Shabana Mahmood who've spoken out very publicly. We saw Lucy Powell, who's the leader of the Commons today, speaking out quite publicly as well. She's got quite an influential role in this because she would see the bill through the Commons. She's in favour of assisted dying, and I think her intervention today was sort of a bit of a kickback. So she was saying, because there has been an argument about whether a private member's bill, a bill brought by a backbencher, is the right vehicle for this kind of issue. And she said, of course it is. That's how abortion was legalised in the United Kingdom in the 60s, for example. That's how homosexuality was decriminalised in the United Kingdom. So it was interesting to see her push back so hard on that today. So within Cabinet, there's sort of a little bit of elbowing going on, I think. So that's all going to affect how the vote goes in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, so we shall see then. Paul, thanks very much. And thank you for listening. For more on this, do head over to our website or ITVX. And do have a look back through our other quick briefings on a range of headline topics to find out what you need to know. Until next time, thanks for listening.